Indonesia is the leading economic market in Southeast Asia today, thanks to its prime shipping location. However, did you know that its economy has also generated substantial religious toleration between the Muslims, Catholics, Hindus, and Buddhists, who all call this nation home? People have been drawn to Southeast Asia for millennia, but this collection of islands and coastal lands is more than just a tourism hub. Archaeologists believe people have lived in Southeast Asia for at least 40,000 years. The people have always been resourceful and quick to adapt to their environment. Their resourcefulness started with traveling in boats when the last ice age cut off their connection to the mainland. The people learned how to build farming communities and create sustainable lives. Throughout their history, the people of Southeast Asia have had dynasties and regimes, and they have seen their share of the dangers of colonialism when other countries came for their spices and natural resources. Despite its long history, Southeast Asia is an economic giant today, but its experiences with colonization have shaped how it interacts with the international community. How did colonization change Southeast Asia? Southeast Asia has seen several waves of colonization, beginning as early as the 1200s with the Islamic powers. Historians believe the process was gradual, as Muslim merchants visited the region repeatedly, eventually leading to conversions and increased Islamic power. The European powers began arriving in the 1400s, looking for spices. The Portuguese arrived first, but they tended to assimilate instead of colonizing. It was a gentler introduction to European powers, as some Portuguese settled in and raised families. But the Dutch were not as friendly in their first introduction. The first Dutch explorers arrived in Southeast Asia in the 1590s, and their leader, Cornelis de Houtman, was infuriated by the spice prices. The region's king ordered him to leave, but Cornelis shelled the king's court before sailing away. It would take years for the Dutch to repair their relationship with the countries of Southeast Asia. Once they did, the Dutch East India Company acquired and sold spices. By 1682, the Dutch were powerful enough to demand that the people of Benton not trade with the British. Southeast Asia had become a pawn in the economic rivalry between the Dutch and the British. But traditional colonization did not begin until the 1700s. Through the 1700s, the Dutch East India Company continued to gain territory, and when the company disbanded by 1799, Indonesia and Java transitioned from part of the company to official colonies. The Dutch coerced the locals to grow sugar and rice. While they paid the locals very little for their labor, they protected them from bandits and provided better healthcare and education. The lives of the Indonesians did improve as their lifespans increased, and the people began learning about democracy, which eventually led them to rethink the colonial system. However, the other colonies in the region saw more suffering than benefits from colonization. European colonization in Southeast Asia throughout the 19th century tended to follow a pattern. A European country would demand increasingly ridiculous concessions until the Southeast Asian government refused. The European country would then invade and take over the land outright. These invasions were heavily mismatched, with the Southeast Asians' light arms facing the heavy European arms from the Industrial Revolution. It became to be known as gunboat diplomacy because the Europeans would arrive prepared to destroy any settlement that did not agree with their demands. The French colonies in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were coerced for their raw materials, like rubber trees. The locals were often victimized and had no way of addressing the inhumane conditions of the plantations. The British colony in Burma did not fare much better. The British were brutal and fostered resentment between ethnic groups to keep the Burmese from rebelling. Even the United States became involved in the colonization of Southeast Asia. They took the Philippines from Spain in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Instead of giving them the freedom they wanted, the United States made the Philippines its own colony. Although it did have to put down an insurrection, America ran its colony differently than the European countries. It instituted a democracy with Filipinos in all positions and enforced the separation of church and state. Colonialism had mixed results in Southeast Asia, depending upon who was governing, but the desire for freedom ran deep across the region's countries. However, as the Second World War loomed, Southeast Asia became aware of another imperial power with its sights set on the land. Japan wanted its turn with the area's rich natural resources and instituted its co-prosperity sphere to get it. What was the co-prosperity sphere? The co-prosperity sphere was Japan's plan to integrate the countries of Southeast Asia into its empire gradually, but it was hoping to avoid war when possible. Most importantly, Japan wanted to be recognized as a world power by other world leaders. The Japanese presented their plan to the other Southeast Asian countries as a collaboration against Western imperialism, but Japan was hoping merely to replace it with Japanese imperialism. Japan had been growing as an imperial power for years. It had already taken several other Asian areas under its influence, such as Taiwan and Korea, and they had the potential to grow even more. On September 27, 1940, Japan joined Italy and Nazi Germany in World War II, with the caveat that the two countries acknowledged that East and Southeast Asia were under Japan's sphere of influence. As war raged across continental Europe, the Japanese worked to take the colonies of Southeast Asia for themselves. Although Japan had been attacking China for several years, and the attacks had often been brutal, the Western world did not pay as much attention as it should have. However, that changed when the Japanese began seizing the former European colonies. Although the Japanese had not initially wanted war, they were soon forced to extend fighting into Southeast Asia as the Allied powers fought back. Japan started by coercing the French into slowly releasing all control over their colonies, beginning with Vietnam. They started by requesting to stage troops in Vietnam for their war with China. Still, they quickly moved to take complete control of Haiphong, a port city. They soon were building air bases and using resources at will. The Vietnamese had hoped the Japanese would liberate them, but the Japanese quickly dashed these hopes by leaving much of the French bureaucracy in place, preferring to rule through the French. The only real change for Vietnam was who the colonial profits went to. A similar story happened in Thailand, another French colony that quickly became a Japanese puppet with little hope of freedom. However, the Japanese realized that if they wanted to secure other Southeast Asian territories, they would need to use their military, mainly because the American, British, and Dutch had cut off Japanese oil and gas supplies. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched the attack on Pearl Harbor and an assault on the European colonies in Southeast Asia. The Japanese quickly seized the Philippines, Malaya, Guam, Burma, and other colonies. Their forces were battle-hardened and nearly impossible for the Western powers to stop. They continued pushing through 1941 and the first half of 1942. But in June 1942, the United States stopped the Japanese advance at the Battle of Midway. They then slowly began to push the Japanese back out of Southeast Asia. Each island was a bloody battle, but the Japanese were gradually forced to retreat and surrender the land they had just taken a few months before. As the Japanese realized the war was not going well, they began to suggest the possibility of independence in several colonies, such as Burma and the Philippines. It was not true independence. The new nations only had their pseudo-independence as long as they did what Japan wanted. The Japanese were only interested in gaining active support from the local people by presenting them as liberators from Western imperialism. And as 1944 continued, the promises of freedom proved false. The Japanese lost support as the nations returned to Allied rule. However, their time as part of the co-prosperity sphere fueled the Southeast Asian desire for independence. Although the Japanese had only made hollow promises and given pseudo-independence, it was enough to make a return to colonization very unsatisfactory. The people were now determined to have their freedom once and for all. How did Southeast Asia free itself and become an economic giant? Because the Southeast Asian countries had spent so much time under colonialism, their path to freedom was riddled with struggle and strife. However, each colony had its own journey, and some of them, like the Philippines, had a relatively easy journey. The United States had been working to help the Filipinos prepare for independence before World War II. The Japanese occupation put that plan on hold until after the war. That occupation was brutal on the Philippines, but once the Americans had pushed out the Japanese, the plans for Filipino independence resumed. The only significant difference in the project was that a new president had to be elected because Manuel Quezon had died in 1944. The Philippines was free to manage their economy and begin reaping the rewards for themselves. Other colonies had difficulty securing their independence because the European powers were not ready to release their holds on the Southeast Asian countries. Some of these countries had to fight revolutions before getting their freedom, but the tension in Burma did not escalate quite that far. However, Britain was unwilling to concede to Aung San's demands, a popular Burmese revolutionary and head of the strongest political party. They did not want to grant complete and total independence, so they countered with a longer, more gradual process to give the Burmese their freedom. The Burmese responded by launching massive protests that included a police strike. By 1947, they forced the British to come to the negotiation table, and Burma's general election was held in April 1947. Britain and Burma signed a treaty declaring Burma's independence on October 17, 1947. Sadly, having their independence did not stop the turmoil in Burma, and there were several decades of internal strife that Burma is still working through. Although Burma had a rough road to independence, it did not have to engage in warfare, unlike other countries like Indonesia. They declared independence right after World War II, but the Dutch sent troops to take the country back. The 4-year war caused thousands of deaths and ended with Indonesian independence in December 1949. Since then, Indonesia has been able to grow its economy and enter the international economy. However, the transition for French colonies like Vietnam and Cambodia was even more violent than Indonesia's independence. When Vietnam first declared its independence at the end of World War II, the French took back control of southern Vietnam. Still, they could never regain control of the northern part, which called itself the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Soon, the struggle between the French and the Vietnamese included disagreements about communism and colonialism. As the issue began revolving around the spread of communism, the United States became involved, aiding the French in stopping the incursion of the northern Vietnamese. Their support started with monetary backing in the 1950s. The Americans became more involved as the years passed, but they found that the northern Vietnamese were relentless. People would remember the war for its ferocity and inhumanity on both sides. The war stretched until 1975, when the United States finally withdrew, and Vietnam united as one country. Despite all of the bloodshed and worry about communism, Vietnam quickly transitioned to capitalism to improve its economy, and today the communist country trades internationally. Cambodia's transition to independence was also fraught with violence, as the French attempted to steer Cambodian politics using persuasion, bribes, and coups. Their attempts were only met with failure, and they left Cambodia in 1953. The country tried to maintain a level footing, but soon fell victim to a civil war between the Cambodian government and the communists. The communist regime was so oppressive that Vietnam invaded to end it. Since the end of the war in 1989, Cambodia has been growing its economy, and it has joined the other Southeast Asian countries that have turned the region into a modern economic giant. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about Southeast Asia, check out our book, History of Southeast Asia, a captivating guide to the history of a vast region containing countries such as Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Burma, and more. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.